My name is Steve, and today's talk is called I Read It But Don't Get It, or Tackling Technical Texts. As a start off, I'd love to know how you guys are doing, so if I could get a visual, thumbs up if you're feeling good, thumbs in the middle if you're okay, thumbs down if you're having a terrible day. I see almost all thumbs up, which is super, super impressive. So it sounds like everybody's having a good morning. To give a little bit of a background on myself, my name is Steve. I'm a software engineer, but I used to teach middle school and high school English for 10 years. But like many of us, I transitioned into software engineering through going through a coding boot camp. And even though I was told this many times, I'm shocked by how much of my personal experience as a teacher overlaps with my experience as a software engineer. And that's what I want to get into today. To be really clear about what I want you to get out of this, because I think there should be like deliverables or things you can do the next day as professionals, is I want you to be able to leave today's talk with like 3 more tools or questions. So like no more than that, no less than that. If you leave having 3 more questions that you can ask yourself while reading a challenging text, then I will consider this a success for myself and for all of you. I think you're probably wondering, like, what do I mean when I say a technical text? This is not an actual definition, it's one I made up, but it's one that will be useful. So we all have sort of the same foundation about what today's talk is about. Today, when I talk about a technical text, I'm going to refer to something that's about the writing of code, the development of code systems, code architecture, or any kind of theories about that work. And to be even more specific, that's the technical part of it. When I'm talking about a text today, I mean a book-length text written in chapter formats, so very, very traditional. And the reason I want to say I'm talking about books is when we think about text, that could be a tweet, it could be a blog post, it could be a TED Talk, it could be a conference presentation, there's all sorts of text. Today I want to be very, very literal that I mean a chapter book, okay? If you're wondering what sorts of technical text I'm referring to, if you ever see a book with like a picture of space on it, if there's like an abstract 3D art piece, or most popularly, if there's like a 19th century illustration of a bird, like these are signs that you're about to read a technical text. And why should we even read these, right? Like, why am I even having a talk about how we might tackle these? Someone might read these books because they're actually really commonly used. I know when I started as a software developer, people said, you should read clean code, right? These are oftentimes like guidebooks that we give to early career and mid-career engineers or developers, and even people who have been in the field 10 or 20 years go back to read these books. Second of all, one reason I think that these more traditional books are useful is they present longer arguments for particular approaches to code. You can read a tweet that tells you something really interesting, but that argument is incredibly compact, and the amount of information you get is very compact. By reading a book-length text, you're getting a different kind of set of evidence and a different kind of argument, and that's going to lend itself to different kinds of learning. I want to lay out a roadmap of where we're going to go today. Now that we've established what is a technical text, why should we even read them, and why might they be useful, I want to first start to tell you about how I found out that I was a disengaged reader, that I was not engaged in reading technical texts. 2, I want us to talk about what does that mean when I say engagement? Like, what does an engaged reader do? 3, I want to show you practical examples of how I put the theory from part 2 into practice. So some of you who are kind of itching like, well, what do you actually do if you want to be more engaged with the text? Part 3 is going to be the literal transcription of what I did. And then last of all, I want us to think about extension. How can we take these ideas outside of just reading technical texts? So I'm going to start by telling you a story about a presumable student that I had. We'll say his name's Jason, 7th grader. And we have independent reading time. So he gets to choose his book, he gets to read it, and every time I look over during independent reading time, he's nodding his head, his eyes are moving, he's turning the pages at an appropriate rate. He's indicating physically to me that he is reading a book. He looks like he's engaged. But teacher Steve, who had a terrible haircut, might ask him like, hey Jason, how's your book? Because I've read that book. Jason says, good. Now, I can't tell if this is an actual review of the book or if he's just being like a monosyllabic teen. So I ask some more questions. I ask, well, what do you wonder about the main character? Like, what do you think about her? She's nice. This sets off a suspicious alarm bell in my head. He does not actually sound that engaged with the text because the main character is a serial killer. She's not actually very nice. So while he's physically reading the page, he's physically reading the words, he's not really making any sense out of the book. So let's fast forward 10 years. Now Steve, that teacher, has a better haircut, better hair product, and he's now a software engineer. And at work, they're going to be reading object-oriented design. And he's super excited. He's going to read it with coworkers. And he's convinced he will finally have more technical knowledge to help him understand some of the things that he's missing, because he went to coding boot camp, right? So he goes to the first meeting, and a really wise engineer says, what did you think of that second chapter? It was good. When she follows up with like, oh, what do you think she was ignoring in the second chapter though? Like, it felt like there was a lot of holes in her argument. Steve just says, sounded good. This should set off suspicious trumpet sounds in your head because Steve does not actually sound that engaged with this book. And the reason this was like really shocking to me, I'll move out of this like weird third person where I'm talking about myself as if I'm a character in a book. The reason this is shocking is because this kid loved reading. Like, I read all the time as a kid. I never had to work to make sense of texts. So fiction was really, really easy for me. A lot of nonfiction was really, really easy. However, I was really struggling to get engaged with technical texts. And so that's when I decided I'm going to think about how I dealt with a student like Jason. How do I teach a 7th grader to get more engaged with a book? And how can I, as a 39-year-old, put those practices into place myself with a really dense, challenging text? So now we're going to talk about what that means. When I say Jason wasn't engaged with his fictional text and I was not engaged with my technical text, what does that mean to be engaged? What does that mean for a reader to be engaged with the book? I want to first start off with some like baseline assumptions so you know like theoretically where I'm coming from when I talk about reading. First of all, reading is a skill and that's something you do. Note up there that do is italicized. Hard to see because it's a little 2-letter word, but it is an active verb. I think a lot of the times when people think of reading, you open a book and just words and ideas come into your head. But real meaningful reading and making sense is an active verb. It requires actual thinking, being aware of your thinking, which we'll get into, but it is a skill that you have to practice and oftentimes learn. 2, this might be obvious, but I think it's worth saying, is just because you read well doesn't mean you're smart. And conversely and importantly, just because you're really smart doesn't make you a good reader, right? Like, I like to think of myself as a smart-ish. I live near the city of Smart, but I was really struggling to be a good reader of technical texts. That meant I needed to supplement my reading with new skills in order to make meaning out of technical books. And last of all, this is really important. Texts are not documents set in stone. Part of this comes from my undergraduate degree where, as an English major, you learn that like texts are flawed and they're biased. So we should think of any of these books that we read as a reflection of one person's point of view. It is one person presenting their experience, their argument with the evidence available, but the meaning and richness that come out of a text come from us being in dialogue with that author, okay? We should not take the books literally and 100% true. Instead, it's for us to interrogate and be in dialogue with. And we'll see some of that when I talk about the actual questions you might use while reading. Some other things I want to point out when we talk about what is an engaged reader doing. So an engaged reader has an active mind while reading the text about the text itself. Again, I highlight about the text itself because I am sure we have all had the experience of having an active mind while reading, but we were not thinking about the reading. We were thinking about, we do not have enough lemons for the recipe we're going to cook later. that PR we put up is bad and we have to respond to comments to it. We're not actually thinking about the book. Instead, an engaged reader, their mind is going about the book. And importantly, an engaged reader is aware of what those thoughts about the book are. And this sounds a little like meditation. If anybody is into meditation, part of it is not that you don't have thoughts, it's that you're aware of them. You can notice when you have them and you can label what kind of thoughts they are. Engaged readers can do the same thing. I'm going to create 5 very crude, arbitrary categories here when I talk about the kinds of verbs that an engaged reader does. I say they're arbitrary because 1, all things in life are arbitrary. But 2, I say it's arbitrary because there will be some similarities between some of these things. There's a little bit of previewing in when you review. There's a little bit of questioning when you apply. So there's some bleed over in these, but what I want to argue is that an engaged reader previews the text, it connects while reading the text, an engaged reader questions the text, an engaged reader reviews the text, and last of all, an engaged reader applies what they've learned from the text. An important note here, and I struggled to make this visually work, is previews happens before you start reading the bulk of the book. Applies happens after you've read the book. Most of what you'll be doing as an engaged reader of a technical text or of any book happens during, and that's the connects, questions, and reviews, okay? So, there we go. Great, what's that actually mean? So I've labeled these like 5 big verbs. When we talk about previewing, some of us are really good at this already. And while I describe some of these verbs, some of you may say like, yeah, I already do that. Great, perfect. Some of us already have these skills. Some of us aren't aware that some of these tools are available to us. But a good reader will pick up the book and start to get acquainted with it. You read the back of it. Like, oh, what's this book about? Oh, who's the author? Oh, where did they work? Oh, I know someone who worked there. Who's blurbed about it? Who published the book? You get acquainted with like, what is the actual like big picture stuff about the book? You may look at the chapters, the sections. You skim ahead of time. It's like if you're going on a trip and you enter into Google Maps or Waze or Apple Maps or whatever like proprietary software you want to use for navigation. Before you get into the individual directions, you always look at the big map to be like, where are we going? Are we going north? Are we going west? Are there any big features I need to watch out for? That's what previewing does. And you start to warm up your mind for what you're about to encounter. The next thing, this is where we move into what you do while you're reading, is connects. If anyone has been a middle school or high school teacher or recently been in a middle school or high school, this is probably familiar to you. But when we talk about connects, an engaged reader can make connections in 3 different ways. Arbitrary, but we'll say 3. 1, you might, as an engineer or software developer, read a book and make a text-to-self connection. You read a passage and you think like, how does this connect to something that I've done, to code that I've written? You might also make a text-to-text connection, so you'll be able to say, wait a second, when I read this passage, this reminds me of another book I read. Or this reminds me of a blog post that I read. Or, oh, I saw a tweet that referenced this idea. That you're able to connect what you're reading to other kinds of things that you've read or encountered. Last of all, you can connect it to the outside world. So you can say, and this is where there's like similarity between text to self because we live in the world, but you're able to point out what you see in the book as connecting to other things you've seen outside. Oh, someone wrote code like this. I remember I saw part of our code base that looked like this passage. This one I think is like really obvious in a sense, and I think is really familiar or easy for a lot of people. But part of it is questioning, right? Like while you read, you can ask questions about the text. 1, I'll start on the right-hand side with comprehension. Some of this is like, literally, what are they talking about? I've never heard this phrase. I can't make sense of this phrase. I can't make sense of this meaning. What do they mean? The other part is you might be interrogating the author's point of view. And this gets to that idea that I described that texts are not set in stone, right? It's a reflection of one author's experience. So you might read a passage and be like, I feel like she's leaving something out, or I feel like they might be missing some really important evidence here. So you're thinking around what evidence might best support this, or what's evidence that provides like a counterpoint to what they're saying. You can ask questions while you read. Last of the during the reading verbs is refreshes, or reviews, sorry. An engaged reader will refresh. So before you start a chapter, you might page through what you read before to be like, what were some of the big ideas from the last chapter? Or be like, wait, I remember this sounds familiar. Let me go back to an earlier section where I know they wrote about this. A really engaged reader can summarize. This means that you can, in your own words, restate an idea. This means for me, I will oftentimes close the book, think about what I just read, like I will physically do this, pause, and see if I can restate, in 1 or 2 sentences, how would I put that idea into my own words? If you are able to summarize, you are moving a step closer to comprehension. And last of all is you can identify important ideas. I think when people think about engaged readers, like, oh, pull out your highlighters, right? Like when you're highlighting, that's what you're doing. You're doing one of these like 5 potential verbs. You can identify important phrases, important ideas, important sentences that get at the heart of this idea. This last one, I think, is why we read the book in the first place. All of us nobody's reading practical object-oriented design, no offense, for the plot, right? Like it's not like a real page turner with character development, right? Like it doesn't keep us up at night, like I can't wait, probably for some people. But we read these books because we want it to inform our perspective and our work. An engaged reader is able to take that text and put it into practice. So one way you can do that is at work. That I can read a text, I approach my work the next day, the next week, the next month, and my code or my approach and thinking is different because of what I've learned. I've applied that text to my work. Some of that informs your reading of other texts, that I can finish a technical text, and then when I read another book, I can think, oh, I remember Sandy Metz argued X, Y, and Z, but this author is actually arguing A, B, and C. I can see how these ideas are different. I've applied that text to a new context. And last of all, and this is probably one I do far too much, you can take this and apply it to other parts of your life. An example of this is I was just talking with a friend last week about how the concept of separation of concerns and dependencies is like drawing boundaries in personal relationships. Like if you can take concepts and ideas from software engineering and apply it to other things, you are applying text. You've made sense out of that book in a really important way. So just to review, an engaged reader, before reading, previews the text. They warm up. While reading, they make connections. They question what they're reading. They review what they're reading. And then last of all, they're able to apply what they're reading into other text, into their work, into other contexts. So now we get to the part where it's like, well, what does this actually look like, right? What did this mean? So going back to the original example, this was the book that we were reading as an informal guild among engineers for architecture. Everyone decided to read this. I read the first 3 chapters and I got nothing out of it because I was reading with a blank mind and I was not engaged. So I said, I want to try these ideas on myself. And one thing I wanted to do was to make my thinking visible on the page. So I just grabbed 3 simple supplies. I grabbed an index card, some Post-it sticky flags, and a pen. And my goal was every time I practiced one of those verbs or asked a question, made a connection, reviewed, I wrote it down and I stuck it in the book. I wanted to make sure that what was in my head invisibly, like all of those thoughts that I was thinking, ended up on the page. So I had a visual track record of my engaged reading. What the index card was for was I created 3 focus questions. I chose, if I ever got stuck or I felt like I wasn't thinking about the book, I chose 3 questions. The first one was, when have I seen feedback on code that matches these ideas? How is this, what she's arguing, different from code I actually write every day? And how does this match code I have written myself? The reason I chose these 3 questions was because I wanted to think more. This book was supposed to help me at my work. And so I wanted to be able to draw connections between our Ruby code base and her arguments about how to architect Ruby code bases, right? My initial version, by the way, was like a gigantic page with 18 to 25 questions on it. And I thought that was really overwhelming. So I just chose 3, right? So if you're similarly wanting to do something, think of 3 like review, connects, applies, I can't believe I already forgot, connects questions that you could use to like limit your tool set that you want to use. Now I want to show you some examples of how I was doing this while I was reading. So one example of me connecting was I wrote on this flag in the book, needing too much knowledge to construct objects is a domain problem we have faced. So I'm thinking about the number of times I've had to do test setup, or I've been trying to like use a method and I'm chasing down star args everywhere, or params, like what on earth are these params? I'm 6 methods deep. And so I thought like, I totally know what she's talking about. Needing too much knowledge to construct objects is a serious problem and it's a real obstacle. So I'm making a connection here, right? Like text to self and text to world. An example of a question here is she was talking about private methods and external frameworks, and I actually had no idea what that meant. I couldn't think of an example of that, so I just wrote, what's an example look like to have a dependency on a private method in an external framework? I was just literally writing that out. You will note that I put a question mark on the flag. I wanted to track when I was asking questions and when there were big ideas. I don't think that ended up being a meaningful practice to me, but I point that out because it might actually be useful to you. If you want to go back in your reading and check your questions, using visual symbols like that might be useful to see like, oh, I actually find out I'm asking more questions than I'm connecting or summarizing. Here's another example of a question. She used the phrase, fail to find and promote the entire abstraction. That was a big yikes in my mind. I had no idea what that meant. I reread it, I reviewed it, I tried to summarize it, I was still confused, so I slapped a question on it and I said, what does that even mean? I never got an answer to the question, so if one of you knows, please feel free to email me. Here's an example of reviewing. I say, focus on what messages need to be sent, not who or what sends them. This was me summarizing. So I was taking her paragraph that she wrote here, and I said it in one brief phrase or sentence. So I thought this was an important idea, so I tried to summarize it myself. Here's an example of me identifying an important idea. I wrote, tests are the record of the interfaces. That seemed like a really important idea, and I wanted to take that away, so I wrote it down. Here's an example of where I did 2 in the same paragraph. Up there, she said something about inexperienced programmers do not understand, and it's blocking the rest of it. But it was definitely describing me as an inexperienced programmer not understanding something. And so I wrote, sounds like me. Like I remember making the kind of mistake she described. And just below that, I identify a big idea. The reason I show this evidence is I want to point out that within the same paragraph, within sentences, you can be applying, you can be reviewing, you can be questioning, that all of these things happen simultaneously and rotate between them. It doesn't mean anything bad or good if you're summarizing more than you're reviewing, or that if you like connect and then you review later, because it just means we're thinking and making sense of the text all the time. So after doing this exercise, I want to point out what changed for me. One, by making my thinking literal on the flags and being aware of my options. Once I became aware of what a really thoughtful and engaged reader does, I noticed I was more mentally active. I was asking more questions, I was thinking more about the code base, it was more applicable to me. I was more aware of what was confusing, and what was surprising is less was confusing to me than I thought. I walked out with a little bit more confidence, which I needed because I 95% of the time do not feel confident about my skills as a developer. And last of all, much to my shock, I was interested in what was coming next. Like I remember she was previewing like, oh, we'll talk about duct typing. I was like, oh, I can't wait to get to duct typing. I never thought I would say that phrase in my life. As a caveat though, I want to talk about what didn't change for me. I was not able to apply this to code the next day. So this idea that like, I read a book, suddenly I'm a senior engineer, like did not happen. Second of all, I wasn't always sure how to apply this to our code base. Because she has prescriptions and she uses like that whole bike store and bike model that is like really useful, but I was like, I don't have any idea how this connects to policy term revisions. Like, I don't know how to apply this to our code base. So I did struggle here with the application. And that gets into the last section about application, like what further questions do we have? Again, review, because I want to make sure we all remember our tool set. An engaged reader previews, connects, questions, reviews, and applies. So if you're trying this at home, one thing to keep in mind is just capture your thinking. You don't have to use Post-its. You don't have to use a bookmark. You could use a Notion file. You could have a physical notebook. You could use Cornell notes. But I think the goal here is to make those thoughts in your head visible. One argument why is research finds the more ways that we interact with an idea, the more likely we are to commit it to long-term memory. So if I think something, I might remember it. If I think it and say it out loud, I've increased the chances of remembering it. If I think it, say it, and write it, I've increased the chances even more. So I would say out loud what I was writing as I was writing it to make sure that that idea had a better chance of staying in long-term memory. So just capture your thinking in a way that suits you. If you try Post-its and it doesn't work, cool, don't do Post-its, try something else. 2, note the silence. If you note while you're reading that you are not aware of any thoughts, that's like a sign to you like, I'm not super engaged right now. If you can't think of a connection, a question, a review, an application, that silence tells you you've lost a little bit of your engagement, which isn't a bad sign because what you can then do is stop once per page. So if I'm really struggling to get into a book, what I will do is at the bottom of the page, I'll do what I told my 7th graders, stop and review it. Can you summarize this page in one sentence? And if summarizing is really hard, just on that one page, identify one phrase, one word, or a sentence that is most important, okay? So if you find there's like just an empty silence and your brain is not running rampant with ideas, just try reviewing by summarizing or identifying important ideas. This last one is really important to me. Be patient. The reason I say that is I think we put a lot of expectations on ourselves that like we go to a workshop and we immediately can like set up our whole Docker interface, right? Like I can go to a workshop and suddenly our RSpec files are beautiful. But that's not really how learning works. That like we oftentimes have to encounter the same idea multiple times, and each time we encounter it, we get a little closer. So I could not read Pooter and then immediately become a senior engineer. Instead, my understanding of Ruby systems and how you might construct them got like 15% better. That's fine, right? Like if you get 1 or 2 ideas out of a book and you can apply those 1 or 2 ideas, that's a win. Be patient with yourself. Moving forward, I just have like 2 ideas. If I can apply this to books, I wondered like, how can we actually take this learning out of books and put it into our code bases? People read these books all the time. I'm sure you've been in reading groups and you always read them and you're like, that's great. I don't know how to put this into practice. So I genuinely wonder like, how can we help people bridge that theoretical knowledge into practice in the workplace? And second of all, how can we apply structures like this to other parts that are challenging about being an engineer developer? I think about PR review. Something we say all the time at work is like, well, you just do it and you learn it. And that doesn't feel sufficient to me. We should be able to tell junior, mid-level, and senior level engineers and developers, here is a set of skills or tools to help you do this better. And so I'm wondering, what are other parts of our jobs that we can also create arbitrary structures to help people learn to be more engaged? thank you guys so much. I really appreciate you coming here, take the time to hear me talk about middle school literacy and how it might apply to technical texts. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at stephenwlynch@gmail.com. I'm sorry I don't have Twitter. I'm a real Luddite in that sense. And we have like 1 minute for questions if anyone has one. Love it, there's one here.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
There we go. So I'm actually reading Pooter at work. So your talk really resonated with me, and I appreciate that. Something I struggle with, I'm on a pretty small team, and just about everyone's a senior or staff level engineer, and I'm a junior. And I have a hard time asking questions in that environment. Do you have any tips on discussion questions you have while reading text?
Well, it depends on the things. If you're really just looking to get conversation started, like if you're looking to learn from the senior and staff engineers, that's when I would ask, like, Sandy Metz writes about X idea. I'm wondering, can you point to a place in our code base that looks like that? Like asking them to draw on their own expertise, one, makes them feel really good, but two, you're helping do the work for them of connecting, right? Like if you're unsure of like a really deep, meaningful question, asking other people to connect or to review or to apply. I remember I did that in one book group where I was like, what's one phrase that you thought was really important in this chapter? And to see really smart senior engineers be like, huh, was like, it forced them to do, again, the important work of what engaged reading looks like. Is that helpful? Or does that give you some pointers moving forward?
Yeah, I think so. Especially, I think they like talking, so getting them talking would be helpful.
Yeah, cool. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time. If you have questions, I'd love to answer them on the side. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.